Welcome to the Forge Truth Podcast, where we are building great men as God defines greatness. Forge is a movement of men with a mission to help all men realize they are the deeply beloved, redeemed sons of the Most High God. I'm your producer, Zach, and I'm here to discuss the issues that affect men the most with our two hosts, Dr. Pete Alwinson, lifelong pastor and leader of Forge, and Jason Quinones, Bishop of Core Faith Church in Oviedo, Florida. Men, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, it's good to be back with you guys.
Jason was sick for the longest time.
Yeah, this has been...
You didn't even come to Forge for those times you were sick.
I know, I backslid, so I'm coming back, and you can pray for me.
You still seem sick to me.
Now, yeah, I'm there. I'm getting there.
The way you were coughing before we started, you seem very sick still.
Yeah, I'm not sick. It's just this doesn't want to leave me. That's what it is. But
there's a sin in your life, Jason, I think that you need to repent of.
I know.
No. We don't teach that here at Forge.
Yeah.
Anyway, there it is.
Well, guys, I'm going to cut you off because I do want to get to our guest.
Absolutely.
We have a special guest joining us today for the show. Pete, can you introduce her?
We are privileged today to have Professor Nancy Pearcey with us. And Nancy Pearcey, as a professor, let me tell you guys about her because her bio is incredible. She has accomplished so much, and we men need to know. Her latest book is the book we're going to be talking about today the most, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Guys, this, for the next decade and more, is going to be crucial standard reading for anybody that wants to understand the state of men in America. So you guys need to read that. Pastors, you need to read it. Her earlier books include Love of the Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and two ECPA Gold Medallion Award winners, How Now Shall We Live? That was co-authored with Harold Fickett and Chuck Colson, and Total Truth. So her books have been translated into 19 languages. Catch that. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. And I love this, as a former agnostic, Professor Pearcey has spoken at universities such as Princeton, Stanford, USC, Dartmouth. She's been quoted in the New Yorker, Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Professor Pearcey, that is a big resume, and we are so thankful that you are with us today. Your book, by the way, could be ordered on Amazon. Guys, go out and get it. Get 2, get 3, and hand them out. This is a really important book. But thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That's great. Tell us a little bit about your heart for writing this book. What motivated you to write such a extensive scholarly work on manhood in America today?
Well, first of all, I was surprised by the level of hostility that it's become socially acceptable to express against men. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a respected mainstream publication. The Huffington Post had an editor who tweeted, #KillAllMen. You can buy books with titles like "I Hate Men," "No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?" You can even buy t-shirts that say "So many men, so little ammunition."
Oh.
So I thought, really, I've got to get to the bottom of this. Where is this coming from? And even men have jumped on the bandwagon. A fairly well-known male author wrote, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And this one you may have seen because it came out more recently. So it's not in my book, but the director of the movie Avatar came out saying, James Cameron said, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. Mm. So this was my first reason for writing the book. As I said, we have to understand where this is coming from. You can't really stand against the social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. And so that was kind of the initial impulse, is I wanted to say, I'm an apologist. I write books on apologetics. How do we defend a biblical view of masculinity against this incredible hostility that's in the mainstream world today?
Yeah. Wow. So from a simple defending the faith concept, this book has a super important place in the national debate. Camille Paglia, my favorite lesbian feminist, says that the way we treat men in America is how a culture commits suicide. And I think you quote something similar to that in your book. But this is absolutely crucial. We got a million questions for you.
Yeah, so I know you gave us kind of the one side of the reason why you wrote the book, but I want the guys to hear a little bit about your personal story, which impacted me, because when I was listening to the book, and I just want to say this on the front end, as we were talking about before we started, I'm one of those guys that is not a history buff, and I don't necessarily like to read a lot of history, but I was sucked in to this book. I mean, it was so interesting, and I was like, just so many moments where my mind was blown. I was like, wow, this is how we got here. And just understanding that is so helpful. So thank you again for writing the book. But could you share with our guys kind of your story, and as part of another part of the reason why you wrote the book?
Right. It is the other reason. And I put it in the introduction. I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist, with the middle knuckle extended to create a sharper stab of pain. So not surprisingly, when I was in high school, first of all, I left my religious upbringing behind. My parents were Lutheran. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran.
Yeah.
The way all Irish are Catholic. So my parents, my dad's Swedish, my mom's Norwegian. So of course we're Lutheran. But the weakness of an ethnic faith like that is often parents will rely on the ethnicity to hold their kids instead of having a true personal commitment. And so when I started asking questions in high school, actually, I asked my father point blank, why are you Christian? He said, works for me. That's it. So you can imagine, I just ricocheted off into extreme feminism for many years. I read all the books on feminism that I could find, all the classics, the Betty Friedan and so on. I always had some feminist book on my bedside table for years. Mm. And so then I became a Christian, and I had to start over and rethink from scratch. Okay, what is a positive, biblical, healthy view of masculinity? So as I put it in my introduction, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life. A Christian psychologist interviewed me, and he said, well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches. And so I think that's kind of helpful for people to know that, I didn't grow up in a loving, privileged home. So I had to really fight my way to a positive biblical view of masculinity. And that's this book then comes out of that long-term, many-year process.
And I think that's what gives this book such a tone of authority, is because you're not angry, and the gospel worked in your heart in such a way that God has made you soft and not you were smart before that, but he made you soft toward men, and he enabled you to see the truth and to present it in such a way that speaks to both women and men. And really, the culture needs this. Again, I say, guys, go out and get The Toxic War on Masculinity. You can get it on Amazon. You need to read this book. Questions?
Yeah, so I appreciate you explaining that and explaining your history. One thing that I really think our guys would help them to know is, looking at your story, it would seem that you would just go along with the culture's war against men and toxic masculinity because of, what in your book you were talking about how the culture points to this patriarchy and traditional values as being the source kind of where this toxic masculinity comes from. However, you say some different things. So could you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes, in fact, that was the final reason I thought I have to write this book, is because when I was doing my research, I sort of stumbled across the social science data on Christian men. And yes, you're right. The typical secular narrative is that Christian men, anyone who believes in any notion of male headship in the home, that theology will turn them into overbearing, abusive, tyrannical patriarchs. And in my book, I have several quotes. They were easy to find, but I'll give you just one. This is the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she writes, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is social scientists were listening to accusations like this and saying, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And over the last couple of decades, they've been doing these studies. So I had a dozen or so that I quote in my book. And they found the exact opposite, that when they actually studied Christian men, they test out at the top as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness with their husbands' expressions of love. And by the way, yes, they do interview the wives separately. I get asked that all the time. And that is important. Evangelical fathers spend the most time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples divorce at the lowest rate of any group in America, 35% lower than secular men. And then the real surprise is they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So when I found this, I said, nobody knows this. Even in the church, we don't know this. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find it. If you look at my footnotes, there's lots of academic journals. And so I said, we've got to get this out there. First of all, for the church, so that the church can be more affirming to men, support them, affirm them. I'll give you a quick anecdote. This was one of my graduate students is the head of the women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
Yeah.
So the church needs to stop, stop scolding men, look at this data. And then it's also, like you said a minute ago, it's very important for shattering the negative stereotype that we get in the secular world. It totally debunks what we hear in the secular media. So, and this is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical research. These are evidence-based findings that Christian men actually do test out as the most loving and engaged fathers. Let me give you one quote, because sometimes a single quote can crystallize it. So this is the sociologist who did the largest study on this is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And by the way, he's not a Protestant himself. He's not an evangelical, he's Catholic. So he's not just defending his tribe, so to speak. But to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. And so this is an article he wrote in the New York Times. And he said, this is a direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." And of course, they focus on the wives because the idea is that these marriages are oppressive to women. But no, the happiest of all wives in America, which is astonishing, are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages.
Yeah.
So that's the message we need to get out today.
Boy, that is absolutely stunning. And even in your statistical studies, you show that even those that are nominal Christians, or shall we say liberal Christians, are not as good as some pagan husbands are. But it's the evangelical Christians that rate the highest. And we see that in the men that come to Forge. They want to be good husbands. They want to be good fathers. They love their wives, their kids. They're doing the best by God's grace they can. So thank you for that. That's powerful. We need to get that out there.
And it is important to note what you just said to the nominal Christians. The first pushback I always get is, well, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? In fact, in my research, I found that's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And so You're right. You've probably used it. I have.
Yeah, we have.
I've said it. I've quoted that. I thought it was true. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the researchers
Powerful.
went back to the data, and they made that crucial separation between men who are authentic in their faith, who attend church regularly, who are truly committed, versus nominal Christians. And unfortunately, we have a lot of nominal Christians in the United States. My students don't even know what that means, so I have to explain. NOM, the root there is Latin for name, so it means in name only. And so these are men who might check the Baptist box, for example, in a survey, but who don't actually attend church. It's mostly a family background, a cultural background. And they test out shockingly different. You know, they test out as having all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men. So this is the challenge for the church, right? How can we, on the one hand, be more affirming and more positive and supportive to the men who are doing a good job? How can we reach out to these nominal men who are claiming an evangelical identity, but who actually are testing out as worse than secular men? How can we bring them in from the fringes of the Christian world and disciple them better? That's a huge challenge.
If you were to sit down with a group of, young men in their 20s, let's say, what kind of messaging would you give them? What would you tell them?
Yeah, so what we have to realize is that boys and men are falling behind on all levels. And we have to start by understanding what they're up against. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education, starting in kindergarten, right? They don't have the same fine motor control as girls. And so they can't, use the scissors as well or color. And so already they're starting to feel like, they're deficient. All the way through high school, they do worse on tests and on homework. In my practice, I am now seeing more and more young men who come in feeling defeated and demoralized because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. And even at my school, Houston Christian University, where I teach, when I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So we have to realize what boys and men are up against. There was a book written by she's a best-selling author, and she does a lot of surveys. So she did a book on boys. It's called Boys and Sex. But she asked young men, this was one of her standard questions, boys and young adult men, she would say, "What's good about being a boy? What do you like about being a boy?" And the boys drew a blank. They said, "We never hear much about that. We hear mostly about what's wrong with boys." So we need to realize when we talk to young men, this is what they're growing up with, and how can they counter that? And you know what? Actually, Zach, what I'm seeing is almost now a reaction against that. And young men are gravitating toward the Andrew Tate paradigm, right? The Andrew Tate, fast cars, fast money, fast women. I'll give you a story on that. I got an email from one of my former graduate students who now teaches high school. And she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They even use Andrew Tate quotes in their yearbook. I said, "Where do you teach?" "At a classical Christian school." So here's what we're seeing now. Boys have been falling behind for decades. And now one of their reactions is they're reaching out to these secular paradigms of masculinity that often involve, yes, they're urging men to be strong, to be successful. But Andrew Tate is successful producing pornography. I mean, that he specifically says that. He says, I saw an interview where he said, "I'm a pimp and I produce pornography." These are not healthy models for our young Christian men to be looking up to. But if the church is not giving them a healthy model of masculinity, this is where they're reaching out to these days. So that's kind of the two sides. They're falling behind and they're reacting to that now, not so much by sitting in the mother's basement playing video games, right? That was sort of the classic model of the failure to launch. But what we're seeing now is more and more men are reaching out to the manosphere, to these online influencers who are actually teaching a very negative view, a very secular view of masculinity.
And that's not surprising. It makes so much sense. But thank you for unpacking that. I mean, I'm stunned. I'm thinking, okay, I've got to be more focused on this in my own communication here too. That's so true. Tell me what you think as you look ahead for men in America. Take on a little bit of a prophetic role here. Think ahead. Look ahead with what you know and what you've said. What do you think is going to happen? Is the church going to respond and try to disciple men in a more biblical way? Are our Christian universities going to respond positively?
Yeah, I do think that there's a much more focus on men, even in the secular world, because for a long time, caring about boys was seen as a conservative cause, right? And leftists stood against it. The first book on boys falling behind was by Christina Hoff Sommers, who is a feminist, but she proposed various programs to help boys. After all, think of it this way. Why did girls get ahead? Well, 1972, there was Title IX, which poured millions of dollars into schools. In 1994, there was a Gender Equity Act, which poured millions of dollars into workshops and curriculum and training materials. So there's a reason girls got ahead, and this is good. But the problem is nothing comparable for boys was ever started. And Christina Hoff Sommers back then said when she wrote the first book on the subject, she proposed various programs, and she said feminists shot them all down. They all said, men actually end up at the top anyway, so we should not divert any money to help boys. Well, fortunately, that's starting to change. There's a very recent book, so it's not referenced in my book yet because it just came out. It's just called Of Boys and Men, and it's by Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution. Well, that's a fairly leftist organization, and it's finally become okay for liberals and leftists to actually start talking about our boys. What can we do about boys? They're finally starting to say maybe we should have some programs for boys and men too, because the idea, one of my own students said this to me, by the way, a lot of my female students do identify as feminists. And one of them said to me, why should we care about boys and men? After all, men end up being the presidents and the CEOs and the Hollywood film directors. So why should we care about them? They're doing fine. Well, actually, there's maybe 5 to 10% of men who are at the top like that. On average, men are doing worse, both relative to women and relative to where they used to be. The rates of men falling behind in terms of mental health issues, in terms of drug and alcohol addiction, in terms of homelessness, in terms of crime, 90% of prison inmates are male. Men are falling behind on all sorts of measures today. Even male unemployment, it's not showing up in the normal statistics because they've stopped looking for work. But when researchers dug deeper, they now tell us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. Great Depression era. I mean, we remember what a crisis that was. And so, and also life expectancy. Men's life expectancy has gone down. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. But there's a magazine called The New Scientist that reported on these findings and said the largest demographic factor today for early death is being male. So I do think it's time for us to start having compassion on men and boys and looking at ways that we can devise programs to help them. And like you said, especially within the church, can we become more proactive in supporting men?
Well, I would ask just one question in line with that. Like, so what would you say if you were in a room full of pastors and you were like, hey, you guys could do A, B, C, and D, or just one thing? What would you advise pastors to do in order to really combat this and really be a helpful force in building up the next generation of men?
Two things. First of all, get acquainted with the data. The sociological data I started with is not in the churches yet. It's not widely known. And so we have to be driven by what's true. And it is true that Christian men do better. And that should be incredibly motivating. And then secondly, I think it's time to look at the next generation, right? We're not going to have, let me quote a psychiatrist put it this way. He said, we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers, because fathers are the key to the next generation, whether they end up being having a healthy biblical masculinity or not. There was a 35-year longitudinal study. It won a bunch of awards. It was a very, very well done study, specifically on how can fathers or parents pass on their religious convictions, their religious faith. And they found two things that were surprising. Number one, fathers matter more than mothers. And my female students say, that's not fair. Mothers matter, but fathers matter more. If the father goes to church, if the father is a committed Christian, the children are much more likely to follow him. And then the second thing they found was, it only works, though, if the father has a loving relationship with his children. In other words, he can be a moral exemplar. He can be a leader in the community. He can be a pillar of the church. He can have perfect doctrine and theology. But if he is perceived by children as being distant and cold, they don't follow him. They will not follow him in his faith. It has to be a warm, loving relationship. And what's interesting is that the same thing has been found in the secular world. There was a study done, it was more focused. It was specifically on how to produce masculine boys. And this was interesting because they found the same thing. They said, the researchers said, the father's masculinity is not actually what counts. What counts is how warm and loving and close his relationship is with his son. That is what produces a boy with a strong and healthy and stable and secure sense of masculinity.
Wow. All right. Listen, I know we're getting close to our time here, but just what this whole podcast, but what was just said, men, you got to get this to your pastor, okay? Beg, borrow, steal, make them, pay them to listen to this podcast. This is powerful. Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, by Professor Nancy Pearcey. What a powerful book. What an academic book. What a well-readable book. And Nancy, I got to say that I read a lot. And because I read a lot and have for as old as I am, a long time, I don't read every book as carefully because I don't have to, but I read yours very carefully. It has sticky notes sticking out. It's underlined. I got stuff in the margin. This is a top-level book, and we thank you for your hard work and what you've done. I hope it gets more and more awards than it's already gotten. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Absolutely. And we want to thank everyone at home for listening to this episode of the Forged Truth Podcast. If you have any questions or comments on what you heard today, please join the conversation by emailing us at forge@forgedtruth.com. And if you want to learn more about the Forge movement, you can always check out our website at forgedtruth.com. We'd love your help getting the word out about the podcast by going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a 5-star rating and review for the show. It goes a long way in helping people find the show. Thank you again, Professor Pearcey. And Pete, will you lay down a challenge for our men?
Yes. Professor Pearcey is only the second woman we've ever had on the Forged Truth podcast, and the first was my daughter. and this has been delightful. And I think, men, you have to understand how important your role is. God has called us to be servant leaders within our families. And so get this book, read this book, continue to understand that the Father loves you and has this incredible plan to build you into a great man as He defines greatness. Pour into those you love and follow Jesus with all your heart. Again, thank you to the professor for being with us, and we long for the broadening of her ministry in the Church of Jesus Christ.